This past week in the Washington Post, there appeared an op-ed piece called Five Myths About Jesus, subtitled Challenging Everything You Think You Know. Wow, that's pretty ambitious, isn't it? Challenging everything you think you know about Jesus. And it's written by Reza Aslan, who is the author of the recent bestseller, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, what was interesting about this is that Aslan himself has written this book in which he claims that Jesus of Nazareth was a political rebel who was crucified by Rome for his advocacy of violent overthrow of the government. Itself a view about Jesus which I don't think any contemporary historical Jesus scholars today would defend. It's an utter distortion of who Jesus was, and yet this man is challenging everything that we think we know about Jesus. He says in his opening paragraph, perhaps no historical figure is more deeply mired in legend and myth than Jesus of Nazareth. And I thought, gee, that's a remarkable statement. What about Robin Hood? What about Alexander the Great? Aren't these historical figures equally or even more so mired in legend and myth than Jesus of Nazareth? Certainly, I think they are. He then says, outside of the Gospels, which are not so much factual accounts of Jesus, but arguments about his religious significance, and again, I had to stop and think, well, now that's a strange statement. The Gospels are of the genre of ancient biography. They most closely resemble, in the type of literature they are, the ancient lives of prominent Greek and Roman citizens. And these ancient biographies most definitely did have a historical interest in telling the facts that it would illustrate the character and the exploits of their hero. So if the Gospels are, in fact, of the genre of ancient biography, they are intended to be factual accounts of Jesus and not just arguments about his religious significance. But Aslan goes on to say there's almost no trace of this simple Galilean peasant outside of the Gospels who inspired the world's largest religion. And again, I thought to myself, well, that's just not true. Jesus of Nazareth is referred to outside the documents of the New Testament in Roman, in Jewish, and in Christian sources. So that even if all of the New Testament vanished overnight, you would be able to recover the basic outline of who Jesus of Nazareth was. Moreover, there's a deeper prejudice that this statement evinces. Why say everywhere outside the New Testament or outside the Gospels? Why don't the Gospels count as historical sources? The whole presupposition of this is that the Gospels are not historically reliable sources, and therefore you have to turn to material outside the Gospels. And that's simply not the case. The Gospels are our earliest, most primary sources for the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And it is nothing but sheer prejudice to ignore those primary, earliest sources and turn instead to secondary, derivative, and later sources. Compare, for example, the person of Socrates, the great Greek philosopher. Apart from the dialogues of Plato, there's almost no reference to Socrates in ancient literature. We would have no knowledge of him outside of Plato's dialogues. Contrast that with the New Testament, where we have 4 individual biographies written of Jesus, as well as numerous references and information about him found in the letters of the New Testament. So that in contrast to Socrates, for example, we have a wealth of data about Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, we have more historical information about Jesus of Nazareth than we do for many major figures of antiquity. So although he was an obscure Galilean preacher, nevertheless, and ironically, we have a very great deal of information about this historical person. Aslan then goes on to say, but there's enough biblical scholarship about the historical Jesus to raise questions about some of the myths that have formed around him over the past 2,000 years. Yes, I thought, and enough historical scholarship to reconstruct the broad outlines of the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth and to show the historical credibility of the Gospels as historical sources for Jesus. So I think you can see what a spin this man is putting on biblical scholarship concerning the historical Jesus. Well, what are some of these myths about Jesus that historical scholarship has undermined? Well, when you begin to read the list, it's very evident that he's using the word myth not in a technical sense, as in the study of mythology, but he just means falsehoods, basically. Some falsehoods about Jesus that have been exposed by New Testament scholarship. Well, what are these? Well, number one is that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Because Jesus is called Jesus of Nazareth, the assumption made by many scholars is that he must have been born in Nazareth and not born in Bethlehem. The reason that the early Christian church ascribed his birth to Bethlehem is because it fulfills the Old Testament prophecies in Micah that Bethlehem is where Messiah would be born. Now, it's true that a good many scholars are skeptical about Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. But on the other side of this, I think we need to recognize that Jesus' birth in Bethlehem is multiply and independently attested in the New Testament. We have both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke and the sources they use recording that Jesus was in fact born in Bethlehem. And unless you think that Luke knew Matthew's Gospel, that means we have independent sources for Jesus being born in Bethlehem. And notice that this is totally independent of the historicity of the Roman census that Luke describes as to why Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem. Wholly apart from the historicity of the census, you've got this independent information from Luke and Matthew that Jesus was in fact born in Bethlehem before they moved to Nazareth. Moreover, I think there's very good reason to think that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. In the book of Acts, beginning in the 16th chapter, Luke suddenly, or the author, suddenly begins to speak in the first person. We traveled from Troas to Samothrace. We went to the place of prayer where we found certain women and so forth. And the author of Luke Acts joined Paul's entourage as he went on his missionary journey around the Mediterranean cities and then traveled back to Jerusalem. Now, what that means is that this author was in a position to do exactly what he said he did in the prologue to Luke's gospel. Namely, he spoke with those who were eyewitnesses to the events of the life of Jesus. And it's not at all impossible that Luke may have, in fact, interviewed Mary, Jesus' mother, about the events relating to his birth. It's very interesting that whereas Matthew's story of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem is told from Joseph's perspective, Luke's is told from Mary's perspective. And it's not at all, I think, improbable that this could reflect historical information that Luke gathered when he was in Palestine or in Israel, speaking to the eyewitnesses to write his gospel. Well, the second point that Aslan mentions is even more trivial, and that is the idea that Jesus was an only child. He rightly points out that although this is a doctrine of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, in the New Testament, Jesus has brothers and sisters. So this isn't an error in the New Testament, is it? This is to say that the New Testament is accurate in saying that Jesus had brothers and sisters, and that later church tradition got it wrong. Thirdly, he says, the idea that Jesus had 12 disciples. And what he points out here is that Jesus had a broader group of people who followed him. Remember, he sent out 70 on one preaching mission, and there were others in the New Testament church in Jerusalem who were disciples of Jesus. And so, Aslan says, yes, he had 12 very close apostles, but then in addition to that, many disciples. Well, Of course. And this doesn't show any sort of error in the New Testament. In fact, there was a group called the 12. They are referred to in the early information that Paul hands on in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 5, when he says he appeared to Cephas, or Peter, then to the 12. And this is extremely early information going right back to the fountainhead of the mother church in Jerusalem, indicating that there was this core group of 12 that Jesus had selected to follow him most closely. Fourth, Aslan says, is the falsehood that Jesus had a trial before Pontius Pilate. And here he brings out the usual shtick that Pilate was not a weak-willed governor who could be strong-armed by the Jewish authorities. He says the Pilate of history was renowned for sending his troops onto the streets of Jerusalem to slaughter Jews whenever they disagreed with even the slightest of his decisions, and therefore the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospels is false or warped. Well, I think, again, that's just a misreading of the Gospels. We know from Josephus, the Jewish historian, that in AD 26, that's just 4 years before Jesus was presented before Pilate, in AD 26, Pilate assumed the office that he held in Jerusalem of being the Roman prefect there. And he ordered standards bearing the emperor's image to be set up in the city. His predecessors have been very careful to avoid doing this because it offended Jewish sensibilities against images. And yet Pilate ignored them. He put up the standards. The Jewish leaders came and protested to him to bring these standards down, to take them down. And they gathered a crowd of people that protested for several days about this. Finally, Pilate sent Roman soldiers into the crowd, armed with swords. And upon his order, he had them draw their swords from their sheaths, ready to kill the crowd. And at that point, the Jewish leaders bared their necks and said, "Take our lives. We would rather die than compromise on our beliefs." And at that point, Pilate, seeing that a general riot was about to break out, gave in, relented, and took down the standards. Now, that is exactly the same kind of Pilate that you read about in the Gospels. He's not exhibiting weakness. It is his characteristic stubbornness in the face of the demands of the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. Jesus was brought to him not on Roman concerns, but on Jewish concerns, which for Pilate would be utterly irrelevant. And he could see that these Jewish leaders were trying to manipulate the Romans into executing Jesus because they didn't have the right to carry out capital punishment. And Pilate stubbornly resists the attempts of the chief priests to manipulate him and the Romans into doing their will in executing Jesus. That is until the priests say, "If you do not crucify this man, you are no friend of Caesar's." And then Pilate, seeing that again a riot is about to break out with the crowd, realizing where his political interests lie, gives in and commands Jesus to go to the cross. So I think that far from giving us an unrealistic picture of Pilate, the Gospels give us a very realistic picture of the man that we know to have been the Roman prefect during Jesus' time. Finally, the fifth point that Aslan attacks is that Jesus was buried in a tomb. And this is remarkable because this is one of the facets of the historical Jesus that is acknowledged far and away by most historical Jesus scholars today, that Jesus was in fact buried in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea. Aslan says the Gospels say that after the crucifixion, Jesus' body was brought down from the cross and placed in a tomb. If that were true, he says, it would have been because of an extremely unusual, perhaps unprecedented act of benevolence on the part of the Romans. Now notice that he doesn't have any specific evidence to show that Jesus was thrown by the Romans into some sort of a pit, a shallow earth grave, where his bones could be dispatched. He's just going on the basis of the general background knowledge that we have of that time. But that background knowledge can be overweighed or outweighed by the specific evidence that we have in the case of what happened to Jesus of Nazareth. And when you look at the specific evidence, what we find is that, in fact, Jesus was not dispatched by the Romans in a mass grave, but rather he was buried properly by an emissary of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. What are some of the reasons that have caused New Testament scholars to come to this conclusion? Well, first of all, the honorable burial of Jesus in the tomb is attested in multiple independent early sources. All of our sources are unanimous in saying that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. And some of these sources, like the pre-Mark and Passion story, on which Mark bases the Passion, and the information in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5 are some of the earliest materials in the New Testament. So the honorable burial of Jesus is not a legend or a myth that grew up decades and decades after Jesus was dead and gone. Rather, it goes right back to the earliest New Testament church in Jerusalem. Secondly, Joseph is probably the historical person that buried Jesus. We actually have very good reasons to think that Jesus was buried by this man, Joseph of Arimathea. Namely, if Jesus had not been buried by Joseph, then any later legend or myth would have had Jesus' faithful disciples bury Jesus in the tomb, or maybe the members of his own family place him in the tomb. In fact, this Christian inclination is so strong that when you look at modern passion plays or even Mel Gibson's movie The Passion, who buries Jesus in those movies? It's not just Joseph of Arimathea, it's his mother who is there attending to the body carefully, his family members, or John, the disciple. The disciples are there. Very different from what you have in the Gospels. It would be a source of real embarrassment to the early church to have the disciples all hiding in cowardice from the Jewish authorities, while Jesus is given a proper and honorable burial by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the very court that condemned Jesus to death. So the criterion of embarrassment strongly supports the historicity of Jesus' burial by Joseph of Arimathea. Thirdly, the story has what's called verisimilitude. That is to say, it corresponds to what we know about what was done at that time. The Romans honored Jewish sensibilities about not leaving people on the crosses overnight because it would defile the land and defile the Passover. And so they would allow the Sanhedrin to take care of these bodies and get rid of them. They would break the legs of the victims so that they would expire quickly and not remain on the cross. Moreover, archaeological finds of first century tombs show that tombs with a disc-shaped rolling stone are very rare in the first century. We only have about 4 tombs extant from the first century that have this kind of disc-shaped rolling stone over the door. And whom did these kind of tombs belong to? They belonged to members of the Sanhedrin and other wealthy members of Jewish society, like the chief priests. And the way the tomb is described makes it very evident that that is the kind of tomb in which Jesus was interred. So it fits very beautifully in with the story of Jesus' burial by Joseph. Finally, the earliest Jewish polemic never denied that Jesus was properly buried and that the tomb was empty. What did the earliest chief priests and Jewish authorities say when the disciples began to preach Jesus' resurrection? They said the disciples came and stole away his body. They didn't say that his body had been dispatched by the Romans and it was now lost, or that it was still there in the tomb. Rather, they tried to explain away why the tomb was empty, so that the earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection itself presupposes that Jesus was properly interred in a tomb and that that tomb was found empty. So, in fact, none of these supposed myths that Aslan identifies about Jesus are, in fact, I think, palpable falsehoods. Or I shouldn't say they're not falsehoods on the part of the New Testament. That is to say, the idea that Jesus was an only child or that he had only 12 disciples rather than more is not something that is affirmed by the New Testament. But I think that this editorial is instructive because it shows what kind of disinformation is publicly disseminated in our great newspapers and periodicals today concerning Jesus. And I want you to be aware of that so that you know how to answer those who read these editorials and think that, in fact, Jesus is hopelessly mired in myth and legend.